So why did Japan and Korea hate each other? Well, here's the thing. The amount of terrible things that we could talk about in this episode is simply too numerous to tell. Both in the sense that we have a time limit, and also because I do not want this video to be immediately taken down. And as a result of that, we're going to have to kind of limit ourselves here. You see, the two nations share a bit of a complicated history. They've fought off and on since at least the 7th century, and Japan has repeatedly tried to invade the peninsula, something that has led to a natural degree of animosity among.
My question is, why does Japan always try to invade people? And the rebrand for Japan was insane.
The Korean population. So I guess the question is, how did all this happen? Well, in order to understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Relations between Korea and Japan go back at least 2 millennia. Sometime after the 3rd century BC, people from the 3 kingdoms of Korea, and no, we're not talking about that 3 kingdoms period, had started to move southwards into the Kyushu region of Japan. Knowledge of mainland Asia was then transmitted via Korea to Japan, and this is the way that things would work for effectively centuries. That is, of course, until Japan would get direct contact with China. See, that's the funny thing. That was always the goal of Japan, as well as many other societies over the course of history. They always wanted direct contact with China itself. We're talking about direct trade with a nation that is the most supreme power in all of Asia. And as a result of that, Korea would over time lose importance until it became a kind of gradual stepping stone for.
For some reason, I always thought it was Korea in the north, and then China, and then Japan. I don't know my geography. I did not know Korea was between China and Japan. I didn't know that.
The Japanese to reach China. But you know, if they wanted direct contact, then they were going to get it. Just not in the way that they wanted exactly. You see, it was in the middle of the Kamakura period that Japan would suffer from the invasions of the Mongol Empire, then the Yuan dynasty, which was then the dominant power on the continent. It, along with its partner kingdom, the Goryeo of Korea, would go on to invade the island nation. And so in order to invade Japan, the Mongols had ordered the Koreans to manufacture around 1,000 warships, though this would ultimately end in failure. The 2 Mongol/Korean fleets were destroyed by storms, thus giving rise to the myth of the kamikaze, the divine winds that would protect Japan. Relations after this period were largely then
Why does kamikaze mean suicide now? If that's because I studied Japanese. I know kamikaze. I know that means wind. That means god of wind. So I don't understand why that means suicide now.
Confined to simple trade missions and a few coastal enclaves of Japanese people in southern Korea. That, or pirate activity. And oh boy, was there a lot of pirate activity. There was so much pirate activity at this time that in China, to be Japanese was synonymous with being a pirate. That is just what you were.
Wow.
But then, things would change again when the full-on invasions would happen. You see, Japan was going through a little bit of something called a civil war in the 15th and 16th centuries. Something that was called the Sengoku Jidai, or the Age of War. This being because for over a century, the entire country was in a state of battle royale between different warlords that were trying to assert their own regional power over the rest. The invasions of Korea in 1592 and 1597 were then executed by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the guy who in 1590 had established control over all of Japan as the dominant warlord. Now, the idea behind this war, the reason why they would do it in the first place, was to exert Japanese influence with the ultimate goal of taking over China, and more importantly, to give his soldiers something to do. See, that might sound weird, but you have to understand that after over 100 years of civil war, there were a lot of warriors who now, very suddenly, didn't have a job anymore. And for a new government, that is a very, very dangerous thing. Thus, giving us the Imjin War, where Korea would serve as a jumping point for further invasions into China.
Hey man, it's boring, man. We ain't got nobody to fight. What do we do? Hey man, let's just go invade Korea. Really? I mean, they're not really doing anything to anybody. They're kind of just chilling. Nah, fuck it, bro. Fuck them. That's literally essentially what Japan did.
These campaigns, though, would ultimately end up in defeat, contributing to the collapse of Toyotomi's power. For Korea, the consequences, though, were significantly worse, with widespread desolation. And as you can probably imagine from this, relations between the two powers were definitely sour at that point. Hideyoshi's successor and the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, Tokugawa Ieyasu, did wish to resume trade and a sense of normalcy to their relations. And so, he initiated negotiations with Korea on a basis of equality. In 1607, formal relations were restored, and a mission of several hundred Koreans was then received at Edo. A total of 11 such embassies would arrive in Edo during the Edo period from around 1600 to 1868, which provides an important diplomatic contact during this era of rather Japanese national seclusion. But that all being said, despite this period of isolation, Japan never really forgot about its ambitions. Following the opening of Japan by Western powers and the resumption in 1868 of direct imperial rule, the nation very quickly embarked upon a new era of development as a modern state. Korea, on the other hand, would rather maintain a policy of
What game is this? Can somebody, if anybody watches this, can you post in the comment what game that is?
seclusion, and as a result of that would very quickly fall behind the Japanese. And so then in 1875 you would have a Japanese warship, something that was dispatched for the standard purpose of surveying the Korean coast, which was fired upon by a Korean shore battery when it entered the mouth of the Han River. Now this would be the first such incident that Japan would use as a pretext for conflict. A fleet of 6 naval vessels would then be sent early in the following year in order to force the signing of the Treaty of Akangwa, something which provided for the opening of 3 Korean ports, the appointment to each of a Japanese consul, with extraterritorial powers over Japanese nationals, as well as exemption from customs duties. Japan now effectively had its own unequal treaty that it was able to force onto another power. Now at this point we are going to be missing a number of events because this period is a rather large one and there is a lot of stuff that happens, so we're going to try and go through this as succinctly as possible. But this is the gist of what happens. In the wake of the Capson political coup of 1884, Japan and China would agree to withdraw their troops from Korea. However, in the spring of 1894, you would have the Tonghak Rebellion that would break out, and the Korean government would then call upon the Chinese for military assistance, and Japan would also to send an expeditionary force, something which would clash with the Chinese in July of 1894, leading to the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Victory in that war, as well as in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, would then enable Japan to stem the influence in Korea of China and Russia, and, under the threat of military force, effectively gain control of it. The signing of the Korean-Japanese Convention of 1905 would then give Japan full administrative control over Korea's foreign affairs, thus turning it into a protectorate, and providing for the establishment of the Office of Resident General in Korea. Another convention was signed in July of 1907, just 5 days after the forced abdication of King Gojong of Korea, and this gave comprehensive administrative power over Korean domestic affairs to the Resident General. This was followed on the 1st of August by the disbanding of the Korean army. Elements of the army would raise up against the Japanese, but these were then brutally suppressed. In the end, by 1910, all of Korea was formally annexed by Japan. And this would remain the case for 35 more years until the end of World War II. What we're talking about at this point is the beginning of the Korean colonial period, something that to this day for many people in Korea bears a very harsh memory. And here's why. Control of the land within Korea was managed by a military government, something whose head was appointed by the Japanese emperor. Rules were enforced by a Japanese military police force, which assumed the duties of both the regular police and was charged not only with the enforcement of criminal law, but also that of public health regulations and the use of the Japanese language. You see, under the education law of Korea in August of 1911, Japanese was made the primary language of Korean schools.
So basically, like a police state.
Harsh crackdowns would then be commonplace over the next couple decades. Following the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War of 1937 to 1945, efforts would be made to step up the assimilation of Koreans. Worship at Shinto shrines was enforced, and the principles of Japanese emperor worship were then introduced into the curriculum of Korean schools. By 1940, all Koreans were forced to assume Japanese names. Between 1939 and 1945, some 1.2 million Koreans were transported to Japan.
My question is, if, like, in Japan, they don't call themselves Japanese people. They call themselves Nippon. Or, like, Nihon is the Japanese word for Japan. What is the Korean? Is it Seoul? Is that what Koreans call? Is that really the, like, do Koreans call Korea Seoul? Because if they do, what are they, like Solians? Like what do Koreans call Koreans?
In order to perform forced labor, thousands of Korean women would then be forced to become comfort women, servicing Japanese troops. And towards the end of the Second World War, Korean men would be made subject to military conscription. But in the end, the war would end, and Japan would lose. Korea would finally gain its independence after 35 years of Imperial Japanese rule. But that didn't mean it was going back to what it was. Per the Yalta Conference agreements, Soviet forces would accept the surrender of Japanese forces in northern Korea above the 38th parallel, and US forces south of that line. Korea was thus divided into Soviet North Korea and the US South Korea.
I mean, now I understand why Bruce Lee hates Japan so much.
South Korea would then refuse any diplomatic and trade relations with Japan for decades.
Although Bruce Lee is Chinese, he's not Korean, but I guess all Asians just hate Japanese people.
Using the tensions with Japan in order to rally support for the South Korean government as a way that it could legitimize itself. With time, this would ease. In 1965, relations would begin to normalize, but really, the past was never forgotten, much as some Japanese politicians may probably prefer. Denials of war crimes and slave labor, compensation for victims, visits to war memorials by heads of state that are seen as distasteful. There are many different factors that affect the relations between the two states and their people. Perhaps most recently, in 2019, Japan would impose controls on the export of semiconductor materials, something that would restrict export to South Korea and remove the country from its preferred trading nations list.
I know in a previous video, I did a video on Japan versus China, where I said Japan in 5. Honestly, I take that back, man. Japan is too sketchy. And I did some research into Dragon Ball Z. Dragon Ball Z is super sketchy. I take that stuff back, man. I take it back.
Experts reviewing this have said that the controls may be in retaliation.
Like Japan is literally like China and Korea are like, yeah, remember when you like tried to enslave us? And Japan's just like, moe, anime, cute girls in high school uniform. Like, they're just trying to like, yo, that rebrand is crazy.
After South Korea courts ruled that Japanese companies had to pay restitution for Korean forced labor during World War II, something that, to this day, continues to mar the minds of the public and people. Really, at this point, only time will tell where relations will go from here. But that is the story of the rivalry between Japan and Korea, and why the two have a tendency to hate one another. Everyone, this has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything. Thank you very much for watching this episode. I ask that you...
Yeah, I don't know. Japan is sketchy. Like, I grew up on Japanese stuff, but the more you dig into Japanese history, it's just weird. Like,